Chapter 4 Mentative Induction. As wonderful as is the manifestation of mind power within the limits of the form of the thing, cell, plant, animal, or person, and which produces the effects known as local action, movement, etc., there is still a greater wonder to be witnessed in the manifestation of the same power beyond the limits of personality or form in which it originates. And it is to this manifestation of mind power that I am about to apply the term telementation. I may as well explain my terms at this place and time. In the first place, I use the term mentation in the sense of mental activity, the term being derived from the Latin word mentis, meaning the mind, and the suffix ation, meaning action. So, mentation means mental activity. From mentation we derive mentative, or relating to mental activity, mentate, or to manifest mental activity, etc., etc. From mentation, also, I derive the term telementation, which, so far as I know, was originally coined by me several years ago. The word is derived from the Greek word tele, meaning far off, and the word mentation, above explained. Telementation means mental activity at a distance, or mentation exerted over space, or long-range mental influence, etc. I have been led to the coining of this new term, designed to take the place of telepathy, for the reason that the latter term is improper and misleading. Telepathy, according to its root words, really means to suffer at a distance, or the feeling of the pain of another. The suffix pathy being derived from the Greek word meaning to suffer. It may be used properly in connection with the sympathetic transference of pain or disease or similar mental states, but its use otherwise is improper. It is being discarded by the best scientific authorities, who prefer the term thought transference, etc. I have thought it advisable to use the term telementation in this connection, believing that it meets the requirements of the case better than any other term of which I have any knowledge. I expect it to come into general use before long. And now about the transference of mental states from one thing or person to another. I shall not attempt to go into a discussion of the phenomena of thought transference in this work, for the reason that it is too well established and too generally known to require an argument in its favor from me. To thousands of careful investigators, it is an established fact, and anyone who will take the time and trouble to conduct the experiments may reproduce the phenomena to his own satisfaction. Moreover, there are instances of telementation arising in the everyday life of nearly every person. Such instances being of the spontaneous order, that is, not having been expected or sought after. Those who are desirous of obtaining proofs of telementation beyond their own personal experiences are referred to the records of the English Society for Psychical Research, which contain the carefully noted reports of many very interesting cases which have been conducted by the Society under the most careful supervision and scientific requirements. The circulation of mind power is as real a natural phenomenon as the circulation of air, water, or of the blood. There have been many theories advanced to account for telementation. There has been much talk of two minds or dual mentality, etc. in this connection. In this work I shall have very little, if anything, to say regarding man's two minds. I, of course, am fully conversant with the subject of the subconscious and superconscious regions of the mind, but I find this principle of telementation to have its roots still further back in the scale of evolution, back before consciousness as we know it existed in the created forms of matter or life, back to the plane of mind in inorganic matter, and therefore I shall not attempt to urge any two-mind theories to account for it. In fact, I believe that the mind of man is far more complex than a dual mind combination. There are many more planes in the regions of the mind than the objective and the subjective minds of the dual mind authorities. I find the basis for the theory of telementation far back in the scale. In fact, at the lowest extreme of the scale of things, I find it in the atoms, or in the particles of which the atoms are composed. In the first chapter of this work, I called your attention to the manifestation of mind power among the atoms and particles of matter, which was evidenced by action, motion, and movements resulting from attraction and repulsion of these atoms and particles. In other words, I showed that physical forces were produced by the motions of the particles or vibrations of the atom, which arose from states of like and dislike, love and hate, attraction and repulsion, pleasure and pain, among these tiny particles of matter, and it is here that the elementary principle of telementation is noticeable. Here is where it may be seen in full primitive force and operation. If you will think for a moment, you will see that the motions of the atoms are twofold. One, the voluntary motion of the atom toward the other atom to which it is attracted by chemical affinity, and two, the movement of the atom occasioned by the attractive force exerted by other atom in the same manner that a magnet draws the needle to it. Haeckel has told us that there is a voluntary movement of the atom itself in response to the desire awakened in it by the attraction. How does it become aware of the presence of the other atom unless something passes between them? And that something must be in the nature of a mentative current, for there is nothing else to pass, because all other forms of energy being produced by vibrations of the atoms arising from mental states, the mind power, must precede the physical energies and must be the something that passes between the two atoms. Feeling the presence of the other atom, the first atom moves towards its affinity voluntarily, and just as you move your arm or walk, the atom probably exerting a push upon the ether, which must be to the atom or particles what the air is to the wing of a bird, or the water to the fin of the fish. But there is another case of motion, as we have seen, the mutual pull of the attracting atoms. And what manner or kind of energy is it that thus draws or pulls the other atoms? It cannot be electricity or magnetism, for those forces, as we have seen, are produced by a rate of vibration occasioned by the mind power in the atoms themselves. Therefore, we must go back to the antecedent force, which is mind power, and attribute to it the drawing or pulling force which moves the atoms towards each other. That this attracting or pulling force is in operation between the particles of matter, there can be no doubt. No two atoms of matter are in absolute touch with each other. There is always a distance between them, a space which thus separates them, which never can be traversed or overcome. There seems to be an individuality in these tiny particles which, although allowing them to form combinations, nevertheless prevents absolute blending or amalgamation. There is always a keep your distance or thus far and no further principles in nature, which holds every particle of matter individual and alone. Every ion, electron, atom, and molecule of matter is alone and separated even from its closest affinity by a touch-me-not circle of influence, which is also mentative in its nature, in my opinion. Even the hardest diamond or piece of steel is composed of molecules close together but yet separated by this circle of influence, and every molecule is composed of several atoms between which the same law operates, and every atom is composed of many ions or electrons which have distances between them. So true is nature in her proportions and law that scientists assert that in the hundreds of ions of which the tiniest atom is composed, and which atom is invisible to the sight by reason of its smallness, there is a distance between, observed and maintained by these particles, which bears the same proportion to their sizes that the distance between the planets of our solar systems bears to their particular size. In other words, that the ions composing an atom are akin to a minute solar system, each ion being attached to the other and yet kept at its distance, the combined pull and push of the desire and the keep-off respectively, tending to cause them to circle round and round each other. And what is the force that traverses the space across which the particles themselves cannot travel? It is not electricity or magnetism, for those forces are but the results of these circlings and vibrations, and not their cause. And moreover, science has not discovered electricity or magnetism between the atoms. And what holds the atoms and molecules of matter together, or rather in proximity, what causes their propinquity? Science answers chemical affinity and cohesion. But these terms are merely names, and science does not explain the nature of the force employed, but it knows that it is not electricity or magnetism, or any other known physical force. I answer, it is mind power, exerted over the intervening spaces by telementation that attracts and holds these atoms and molecules in their places, and yet keeps them at their distance. Mind power, the existence of which in the atoms was postulated by Haeckel, and which always has been taught by the occultists. And so finding that telementation exists in the elementary forms of substances and physical things, I am justified in looking for its presence and manifestation from that point of the scale upward. And I believe that the vibrations of mental states, feelings, desires, etc. are transmitted from one mind to another by telementation, arousing similar states, feelings, desires, etc. in the receiving mind, along the lines of what we call induction in physical science. But before considering induction, I would ask you to consider the following quotation from Flammarion, the eminent French scientist, who says, "We sum up, therefore, our preceding observations by the conclusion that one mind can act at a distance upon another, without the habitual medium of words or any other visible means of communication. It appears to us altogether unreasonable to reject this conclusion if we accept the facts. This conclusion will be abundantly demonstrated. There is nothing unscientific, nothing romantic in admitting that an idea can influence a brain from a distance. The actions of one mind upon another from a distance is a scientific fact, or the action of one human being upon another from a distance is a scientific fact. It is as certain as the existence of Paris, of Napoleon, of oxygen, or of Cyrus. He further states, there can be no doubt that our psychical force creates a movement in the ether which transmits itself afar like all movements of ether and become perceptible to brains in harmony with our own. The transformation of our psychic action into an ethereal movement and the reverse may be compared to what takes place on a telephone, where the receptive plate, which is identical with the plate at the other end, reconstructs the sonorous movements transmitted not by means of sound but by electricity. As I have said, I account for the transference of mental states, etc. by theory of mentative induction, which I believe to be the theory more fully meeting the requirements of the case than any dual mind or similar hypothesis. The term mentative induction will be readily understood by those familiar with the phenomena of electricity. The word induction comes from the word induce, which means to influence. In electrical science, the word induction is used in the sense of the process whereby one body possessing magnetic or electrical properties reproduces that property in another body without direct contact. In textbooks on physics, a simple experiment is often given students to illustrate magnetic induction as follows. A magnet is so placed that its poles project over the edge of the table upon which it rests. An iron nail or steel needle is held a little distance below the magnet, so that it will not actually touch the latter, but will be near enough to be magnetized by induction, that is, without direct contact. The nail or needle will have an induced property of magnetism produced by the current from the magnet, and will support another nail or needle by direct contact. This induced magnetism renders the nail or needle a magnet, possessing all the properties of the original magnet so long as the current flows. And, just as a magnet may communicate its properties by induction, so may an electrified body communicate electrical states in another body without actual contact. The textbooks are full of examples to illustrate this law. The theory accepted by science is that the induction is the action of the electrical current through the ether by waves of vibration. And I hold that just as the vibratory waves of magnetism and electricity pass through the ether and produce similar properties in other bodies by means of induction, so do the vibratory waves of mind power from one mind pass through the ether and by induction set up similar mental states in the minds of the other persons within the field of induction. I hold that just as excitement of the particles of matter, excitement being merely aroused activity, may manifest an energy that may be transmitted to another object, removed in space from the first, and then may arouse by induction a similar states of excitement in the particles of the second object, so may the excitement of the mind among the brain cells of the animal or persons be transmitted by telementation to another animal or person in whom, by mentative induction, a similar state of excitement is generated or induced. I hold that there is the closest possible relationship between motive energy and emotive energy. In fact, both are forms of the same thing. I shall not attempt to go into details regarding telementation or mentative induction at this place, for the reason that I shall bring out the principle in detail from time to time by pointing out the manifestations and activities of these principles. But I wish you to fix in your mind the elementary principles of mind power in its phases of telementation or long-distance effect, and of mentative induction, or the process by which like begets like on the mental plane as on the physical. The machinery of mentative processes and activities being hidden from physical sight, we may understand these processes and activities better by using the illustration of corresponding physical processes and activities, particularly when the correspondences are more than mere resemblances, being operations of the same underlying natural laws. For this reason, the illustration or symbol of wireless telegraphy will help us to understand telementation, and electrical or magnetic induction will help us to understand the phenomena of mentative induction. And now let us pass on to a consideration of the activities and manifestations of mind power in its phases of telementation and mentative induction in living creatures, beginning with the lower animals. Mental magic in animal life. I have spoken of the manifestation of mind power among the atoms and particles of matter, whereby the tiny corpuscles becomes aware of each other's proximity, and whereby they move voluntarily in response to the desire aroused by the attraction or affinity of the other atoms, and whereby they also exert a pull or drawing power on the other atoms, and respond to the same attracting force of the other particle. Ascending the scale, we find the crystals building up their forms by drawing material from the fluids in which they are immersed, and there building upon a set pattern and style, as truly as does the builder among the animals or among men. Passing on to the low forms of animal life, we find tiny life forms in the slime of the ocean bed, which are apparently no more than tiny drops of glue cells without a nucleus, which nevertheless perform the functions of all organic forms, being born, taking nutrition, assimilating, eliminating, growing old, and finally dying. After reproducing their kind by growth and division. But the point that most concerns us is that although these creatures have no senses or even rudimentary sense organs, they are aware of the approach of other creatures and of their food. In some way they become aware of these things. How? Man does not know. Moreover, they are possessed of the power of motion, and exert their will in the direction of moving from place to place. Some of these forms of life, when viewed under even a strong microscope, are seen to move by gliding from place to place, apparently at will, and with no perceptible employment of organs of motion, such as false feet, fins, etc. They seem simply to move by pure will. How do they do this? How do they become aware of the approach of other creatures without sense organs or the rudiments of the same? It seems that mentation and telementation are manifested here. Rising higher in the scale, we find many insects seemingly endowed with the faculty of becoming aware of the presence of other insects at distances so great as to render the ordinary senses of no avail. Students of ant life relate many remarkable instances of the kind. Ants at a distance seem to be able to communicate with their fellows, summoning assistance and directing the movements of ant armies. A professor in an American university has related that upon one occasion he met with an instance of telementation on the part of a colony of ants. He stated that he had placed a breeding cage of ants inside of a stone house, the latter having walls 16 inches thick, with no windows and but one door, the latter being so sealed and protected that it was impossible for even a tiny ant to enter its crevices. When approaching this house for the purpose of studying the progress of his ant colony, he would notice that other ants had collected on the outside of the walls, or running about trying to get through the stone blocks. Then he tried the experiment of moving his ant cage from one part of the house to another, first placing it beside one wall and then another, and so on, trying all positions and places. In each case, after each change, when he would emerge from the house, he would find the outside ants grouped on the stone wall as near to the inside ants as possible, changing their position from side to side according to the position of the ant cage inside the house. Many other instances of the possession of the power of telementation on the part of ants have been noted. Another authority relates that a pair of foreign moths were brought to England. There were no other moths of that kind in the country. One of them, the male, escaped in a part of England many miles distant from the place to which the remaining moth, the female, was taken. The female moth was placed in a tiny cage for security and then set out of doors during the night. In the morning, much to the entomologist's surprise, he found the male moth clinging to the tiny cage which contained the female. It was the same male, undoubtedly, for in size, coloring, appearances, etc. it corresponded exactly, besides which there was not another moth of that particular species known to be in England. Similar experiments have been conducted with insects, and there is held to be ample grounds for believing that insects attract their mates by means of some mental power beyond the range of the ordinary senses. Schools of fish seem to have some method of instantaneous communication between the individual fishes composing them, for the entire school moves from side to side, turning sharply, etc., as if were possessed of but a single mind. Some scientists have held that many of the lower animals who live in groups, schools, etc., have mental relations similar to those of the colonies of cells, which seem to have a common mind. There is undoubtedly communication over distances of the cells of the blood in animals, and the phenomenon of the school of fish just noted may be analogous. At any rate, there is some sort of distant mental communication between the individual fishes. The same phenomenon is noted among flocks of birds, as many know who have witnessed the flights of large numbers of birds of different kinds. Wild animals undoubtedly have some subtle sense whereby they find each other when separated by long distances. The return of cats and dogs who have been carried miles from home, and the return of birds to their original places after their migration, may have a similar explanation. There may be subtle vibrations from places, peoples, and objects, which the animals sense at a distance. That animals exert a mental control over their fellows by some form of manifestation of mind power, there seems to be but little doubt among those familiar with the ways of animals, particularly of wild animals. There is a manifestation of something beside physical strength and prowess on the parts of the animal. There is a mental something displayed. The author, A.E. McFarlane, in a recent magazine article on the subject of bad animals, says, "Put two male baboons in the same cage and they will open their mouths, show all their teeth and blow at each other. But one of them, even though he may possess the uglier dentition, will blow with a difference, with an inward shakiness that marks him for the underdog at once. No test of battle is needed at all. It is the same with big cats. Put 2 or 4 or a dozen lions in together, and they also, probably, without a single contest, will soon discover which one of them possesses the mettle of the master. Thereafter he takes the choice of the meat. If he chooses, the rest shall not even begin to eat until he has finished. He goes first to the fresh pan of water. In short, he is king of the cage." Among the animals, we find many instances of the power of charming or fascinating, both of which are told to be but varying forms of manifestations of mind power in the direction of powerfully influencing the imagination, desire, or will of another by mentative induction. This mental fascination among the animals manifests along two lines. One, along the lines of desire operating in the direction of sex manifestation, such as winning of mates, etc. And two, along the lines of will operating in the direction of overcoming the prey of the animal, such as the charming of birds by serpents, or of smaller animals by tigers, etc. These cases are capable of liberal illustration and proof, and natural history affords us full authority for accepting the same. I recently read an account of a naturalist who related that one day in a tropical country he noted a winged insect circling around and around a scorpion. After a beat, the insect made a series of desperate plunges at the scorpion, as if in a frantic desire to terminate the charm, the scorpion soon striking down the insect and afterwards devouring it. It is related by travellers that when one comes suddenly in the presence of a lion, tiger, or leopard, his legs seem paralyzed, and the eyes of the beasts seem to exert a peculiar fascination and power over him. I have seen a mouse manifest the same emotion in the presence of a cat, and the same is true of a rat in the presence of a ferret or similar enemy. On the other hand, every observer has noticed the wonderful charming power that animals exert over others of their kind of the opposite sex. If you have ever witnessed the courting of a bird during the mating season, you will have a keen sense of the reality of the power employed. One of the birds, and it may be either a male or female, will be seen to actually fascinate or charm the one of the opposite sex, the latter lying still with quivering wings and a helpless expression in its eyes when compared with the attitude of the same bird when charmed by a serpent. The resemblance will be striking. I have before me a book written in 1847 which relates quite a number of instances of the operation of mental fascination among the lower animals. I will give you a few of them, condensed and abbreviated. Professor Silliman is quoted as stating that one day, while crossing the Hudson River at Catskill, he passed along a narrow road, the river on one side and a steep bank covered by bushes on the other side. His attention was attracted by the sight of a number of birds of a variety of species who were flying forward and backwards across the road, turning and wheeling in strange gyrations and with noisy chirpings, seemingly centering over a particular point of the road. Upon examination, the professor found an enormous black snake, partly coiled and partly erect, showing an appearance of great animation, with his eyes flashing like a brilliant diamond and his tongue darting in and out. The snake was the center of the motion of the birds. The professor adds that although the snake disappeared in the bushes, frightened at the approach of the men, still the birds seemed too dazed to escape, perched on the nearby bushes, evidently awaiting the reappearance of their charmer. The same book relates an incident of a man in Pennsylvania who saw a large black snake charming a bird. The bird described gradually decreasing circles around the snake, at the same time uttering piteous cries. It seemed almost ready to drop into the jaws of the snake when the man drove off the ladder and the bird arose with a song of joy. Another case is related of a ground squirrel which was observed running to and fro between a creek and a large tree a few yards distance. The squirrel's fur was badly ruffled and he exhibited fright and distress. Investigation disclosed the head and neck of a rattlesnake protruding from the hole of the tree, pointed directly at the squirrel. The poor squirrel at last gave up the fight and, yielding to the fascination, laid himself down with his head very close to the snake's mouth. The snake then proceeded to swallow the squirrel, when his meal was interrupted by the cut of a carriage whip in the hands of the observer, and the squirrel, released from the spell, ran briskly away. Dr. Good is quoted as having made quite a study of the curious fascinating power that rattlesnakes manifest over small animals, such as birds, squirrels, young hares, etc. He relates that these animals seem incapable of drawing their eyes away from those of the snake, and although seemingly struggling to get away, they still gradually approach the snake as though urged towards him or attracted by a power superior to their natural instincts. He goes on to state that the animal approaches nearer and nearer until at last it is drawn into the serpent's mouth, which has been opened all the while to receive it. Dr. Barrow is quoted as relating many instances of this kind known to peasants in all parts of the world. Vatliant, the African traveller, tells of an instance in which he witnessed a shrike in the very act of being fascinated by a large snake at a distance, the fiery eyes and open mouth of which were gradually approaching the bird, the latter manifesting convulsive trembling and uttering piercing shrieks of distress. The traveller shot the snake, but upon picking up the bird he found it dead, killed either by fear or the power of the serpent, or perhaps by the violent breaking of the spell. He measured the distance between the snake and the bird and found it to be 3 1/2 feet. A case is related in one of the early reports of the Philosophical Society, in which a mouse was put in a cage with a viper, by way of an experiment. The mouse at first seemed greatly agitated, which state was followed by a condition of fascination, the mouse drawing nearer and nearer to the viper, which remained motionless, with distended jaws and glistening eyes. The mouse finally actually entered the jaws of the viper and was devoured. Brewis, the African traveller, relates that the natives of an interior tribe seem to be protected by nature against the bite of scorpions and vipers. They are said to handle these creatures fearlessly, the latter seeming to be robbed of their power of resistance. He states that the creatures seem to sicken the moment they are touched by these natives, and are sometimes so exhausted by the invisible fascinating power that they perish shortly. He says, I have constantly observed that however lively the viper was before, upon being seized by any of these barbarians, he seems as if taken with sickness and feebleness, and frequently would shut his eyes and would never turn his mouth towards the arm that held him. Personally, I have seen a somewhat similar case. When I was a boy in Maryland, I knew of a farmhand who was called the Snake Charmer. How he did it I never could find out, but he would exert some kind of influence over all kinds of snakes, poisonous ones included, and would cause them to remain fascinated until, with a quick movement, he would grab them by the neck with his bare hands. This man generally carried a few pet snakes around with him for company. They seemed perfectly contented and would poke the head up from out of his pocket, in order to look at someone else with whom he might be talking to. The Negroes on the farm had mortal terror of this man, and would walk a couple of miles rather than pass by his house. The power of charming animals, dogs and wild beasts, is undoubtedly possessed by some men in varying degrees, and nearly everyone has known of men who could charm the wildest horses, as if by magic. I have read of some burglars who seem to be able to quiet the most ferocious watchdog. The Swedish writer Lindekrantz tells of certain natives of Lapland who are possessed of some process of charming dogs, to such an extent they have been known to cow the most savage greyhound, causing him to fly from them with all the signs of abject fear. Many of my readers have seen or heard of the horse whisperers, found in various parts of the country, who will shut themselves in a stable with a fierce horse, and by whispering to him will manage to tame him completely and make him passive to their will. There are cases recorded in which men who have been charmed by a snake have afterwards given in their experience. One of these cases relates that the man was walking in his garden when he suddenly came into the presence of a snake, whose eyes gleamed in a peculiar manner. He found himself fascinated, as if by a spell, and unable to withdraw his eyes from those of the creature. The snake, he stated afterwards, seemed to begin to increase immensely in size and assumed in a rapid succession a mixture of brilliant color. He grew dizzy and would have fallen in the direction of the snake had not his wife approached, throwing his arms around him and breaking the spell. Another similar case is related in which a man found his companion standing still on the road with his eyes fixed intently upon those of a large rattlesnake, which was regarding him fixedly with gleaming eyes scintillating in its raised head. The man was leaning towards the snake and would have fallen towards it in a few moments. He was crying feebly but piteously, "He will bite me! He will bite me!" "Sure he will," replied his friend. "Why don't you run away? Why are you staying there?" But the man seemed perfectly dazed and distracted and could not answer. The companion finally picked up the stick and struck at the snake, which glided away savagely. The fascinated man was sick for several hours afterwards. When I was a boy, I had a somewhat similar personal experience, although not nearly so serious. Walking one day among a grove of trees belonging to my grandfather, I found myself staring intently at a snake about 2 feet long, whose eyes glistened like large diamonds. In a moment I ceased to see anything but those awful eyes, which glistened and displayed all the prismatic colors to my frightened glance. It lasted but a moment, however, for the snake glided away, seemingly as anxious to get away from me as I was to part company with him. I cannot say whether the spell would have been broken by me if the snake had not moved away. Perhaps it might, or perhaps not. All that I remember now, after the passage of 35 years or more, is that I did not seem to feel fear after the first shock, my feeling and emotion seemingly being that of a great wonder and amazement arising from what I saw in those eyes. But I have said enough regarding the manifestation of mentative induction among the lower animals. There are many interesting instances of this sort scattered through pages of books on animal life, and nearly everyone who has lived in the woods or among wildlife knows of many cases illustrating this fact, which have come under his own observation. I have mentioned these features of the subject merely for the purpose of showing you that we have to deal with a general natural principle which manifests throughout all life. This book has to deal with the manifestation of this force among men. But in closing this chapter, I would ask you to notice the resemblance between the manifestation of the force among the animals on one hand and among mankind on the other. The animals employ the force for 2 purposes, that is, the captivating of mates and the capture of prey. And how do men and women use it? Along similar lines. Yes, I mean this, as startling as it may appear, for is not the use of fascination in the direction of attracting the other sex akin to the sex-charming notice among birds and animals? And is not the use of fascination in the direction of influencing men and women along the lines of business or personal interest akin to the charming of prey by wild animals, serpents, etc.? you may see that evolution simply changes the form of use in this and other natural qualities and power, the force of power remaining the same under all of the changes. And does it not become important for us to understand, study, and guard ourselves against the employment of such an elemental force as this, which manifests along all planes of life from lowest to highest? That brings up the end of chapter 4 and 5. If you have not subscribed already, please do so at the bottom to be notified when the next video is uploaded. Thank you for your time.